Given the COVID-19 pandemic and the many pandemics that are sure to follow, it's important that the government has the legislation and ability to take actions that will save lives. For this reason, I affirm the resolution. Resolved, a public health emergency justifies limiting civil liberties. The roadmap for this case is I will go over the definitions and frameworks, and then I'll move on to my sole contention about pandemics. So firstly, I define public health as the collective assurance of conditions in which people can be healthy. Foliage in 2012 says that the goal of public health is to improve health outcomes for populations through the achievement and objectives of preventing diseases and health consequences caused by hazards and disasters. The thing here is that public health is incredibly important to citizens and to the government because the government needs to be able to guarantee that they will do their best to ensure safety and health for all of their citizens. And the important part about this promise is the underlying promise of preventing death. And I value this preventing death because death is the objective evil against all humans. Patterson in 2003 would argue that death per se is that really the objective evil for us. What is crucially at stake here is the radical interference with the current life process, and the consequence of death itself can be thought of as this primitive evil against all persons. Death is the ultimate end and can greatly disrupt the lives of those who are left behind, filling them with regret, pain, and grief. And this makes it clear why the promise of public health and preventing death is so important. But public health also has implications for future lives, and the criterion is preventing these existential threats. Even at a 1% risk that life is worth living means that you must default to preventing extinction, and this is agreed upon by a wide field of philosophical theories. Palmer in 2015 goes on to say that if we are only 1% sure that the well-being of possible future people matters, it is from the standpoint of moral uncertainty that reducing this existential risk is the most important thing in the world. Future lives are an unknown, but there are sure to be trillions of people after us, and these trillions of lives must be valued. And by valuing these lives, we need to guarantee a secure level of public health for them. Which leads me to my sole contention about pandemics, which pandemics are a direct threat against current lives and lives in the future, thus going against the definition and framing of this case. As we've already seen hundreds of thousands of lives taken from COVID-19 and the lives of every single person else greatly disrupted, we also noticed that COVID was a wake-up call for our poor treatment of our economies and environments, which would put future lives in danger. We must be accountable for our environmental impact and enact environmental regulations that stop disease and mass extinction. Algona in 2020 says that a plan for nature to rebuild our world's shattered ecological infrastructure is necessary, and this effort must go beyond preserving token scraps of nature, treating the symptoms of global catastrophe, or just waiting for a disaster to happen. Everyone's lives have been put on hold for a year now, and we all want things to go back to normal. But understand our old normal is what brought us to a world where there's not enough regulations to prevent horrible environments from creating diseases, which is where COVID-19 came from. So we need to make a new normal where we involve these new rules and regulations to help prevent these diseases from ever becoming as widespread pandemics. And these laws would directly affect public health, because public health is the key to stop disease, because it provides guidelines for disease prevention and response, as well as conducts disease surveillance. Boland in 2012 continues to say that developing disease treatment for prevention guidelines and conducting surveillance is necessary, and a nation whose government cannot perform these functions cannot truly meet the health needs of their citizens. Monitoring environments and preventing diseases is incredibly important to protect public health and to save lives. The impacts here is that it's protecting current lives and protecting the future lives, as we won't have pandemics threaten the entire existence again. And these measures not only create a guarantee of health in the future lives and past the future lives and current lives, but they also prevent pandemics from disturbing all life in general. Whether or not limiting civil liberties in the name of public health is justifiable is inherently very clear, as public health is immeasurably important to current and future lives, which both cannot be outweighed on any front. It is the clear reason why I affirm this resolution. Considering COVID-19 and the many more pandemics that are sure to follow, governments need to come up with plans and actions to keep these pandemics managed and from becoming as globally disastrous as COVID. However, they cannot do this at the expense of minorities. And it's for this reason I negate the resolution. Resolve: a public health emergency justifies limiting civil liberties. In this speech, I will go over 2 observations and then continue to my sole contention about gender harm. The first observation is a resolutional analysis. Public health systems are all public, private, and voluntary entities that contribute to the essential public health services. This is a definition given by the Center for Disease and Control. The thing to note here is that public health isn't one thing. It's a collection of different entities and organizations that represent all groups of people. And when we try to lump them all together and give them an authoritarian laws and rules, which will block out the majority of voices of these people, what we will see is that you can't give this total control because it will end up removing the input from people and losing democracy. And I value this democracy because when democracy is prioritized and domestic and international peace are secured, but in authoritarianism, the inequalities are only made clearer. Albert and Jonah in 2017 said that a liberal democracy, when allowed to consolidate and flourish, is the best path towards achieving domestic and international peace and security. Authoritarian failed states, on the other hand, are more likely to experience conflict and hinder women's equality. Now, democracy and democratic processes are vitally important to ensuring that everyone is represented and all groups are heard. Because when they are not all heard, what we see is that there's violence and unrest, and these marginalized groups face even more stratification. And my criterion here is human rights, because democracy can only be effective when it includes the marginalized and respects human rights. Puncone in 2017 says that countries with strong records of respect for democracy and human rights are far less likely to see civil wars and hybrid regimes. To lower risk of conflict, countries need to focus on strengthening democratic institutions and respecting human rights. Democracy is key to protecting human rights as a whole, and when you give out these authoritarian privileges, like limiting liberties, it will undermine and harm these already discriminated against people, and specifically along gender lines. This leads to my sole contention about gender harm, because when public health systems are magnified structural inequalities and require the sacrifice of women's freedom. Lewis in 2020 says that the pandemic magnifies all existing inequalities, and across the world, women's independence will be the silent victim of this pandemic. With limiting voices and authoritarian laws, people who are already underrepresented continue to be hurt, specifically women. And even in places when women are more employed and are more often to have jobs, they are still seen as caretakers, which often puts them on the front lines when facing diseases. And this is especially bad in places with lower development, when a woman's existence is almost entirely domestic. Public health systems that mask and magnify gender inequality will also make outbreaks inevitable. Wenham, Smith, and Morgan in 2020 said that given their predominant role as caregivers within families as a frontline healthcare workers, women were less likely to men to receive power in decision-making around the outbreak, and their needs were largely unmet. There is inadequate women's representation in national and global COVID-19 spaces. What's important to understand is that women who have to face these pandemics are often the only form of public health in some areas and need to be included on these conversations about disease preparedness. And this would actually cause better outcomes than opposed to just taking away civil liberties and further marginalizing these women. Sadly, they are not the only group to see marginalization along gender lines. Systemic discrimination against transgender people caused transgender people to die from preventable causes. Olby in 2017 says that 31% of transgender Americans who lack regular access to health care. And without access to health care or any kind of insurance, or even the guarantee of care at every facility, transgender Americans are way more disproportionately affected and in a much dangerous position in pandemics. And it's just another case where underrepresented group would be further harmed by removing any democratic protections and decision making around public health crises. This resolution will remove any little representation that marginalized groups receive to public health, leading to the impact of furthering the harms. For this reason, I negate.